and welcome to The Sharpening. I am your host, Josh Peck. Tonight, we have a very special guest to talk about his book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind. Gary Wayne is a Christian contrarian who has maintained a lifelong love affair with biblical prophecy, history, and mythology. His extensive study has encompassed the Holy Bible and Gnostic scriptures, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, Gilgamesh, and other ancient epics, language, etymology, and secret society publications. So lots of interesting stuff. Well, this is an interview I've been looking forward to a long time. I want to get right into it. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Gary Wayne to the show. Gary, how you doing?
Very good, thanks. And so happy to be here. And thank you for inviting me to your show. Looking forward to a very hopefully interesting conversation that your viewers are going to talk about for a while.
Absolutely, I have no doubt of that. I've been looking forward to this a lot too, and I want to for the audience, I want to hold up your book. Thank you again for sending this. It's an excellent book. Let me make sure I can get this in the shot here. Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Excellent book. It's thick. There's a lot of good information here, but it's broken up in a way. There's almost 100 chapters, but they're shorter, so it's easy to digest. Those are the kinds of books I like to read because, you know, a lot of times having kids and doing everything I do, I only have a few minutes at a time to read. So it's nice to be able to sit down for 10 minutes and be able to read a chapter or two. Yeah, I really love the book. I'm not through the whole thing yet, but everything that I've read is just excellent work.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying it. I think you'll find that this book just doesn't stop coming at you. It is loaded with information in every chapter, right through to the end chapter. So, and anything that you're reading in the beginning of the book, it's going to come up in the last part of the book as well.
Good deal. And it's on a topic that, you know, since I got into this, the Nephilim, the Genesis 6 giants, that was what really brought me into this, you know, everything that I do. And it's easy for us, I think, sometimes to think, the people who are in this thing, to think that we've already heard everything there is to know about the Nephilim and all that. But then comes along an author like you to prove all that wrong. And that's what I love. There's still a lot of exciting things to learn about Genesis 6 and at least 800 pages full of stuff, so that's great. Before we get into that, though, for those who might not be familiar with you or your work, could you give us a rundown of your testimony, how you came to know Jesus, and how that led to what you do today?
Well, it's kind of interesting, and I know, Josh, you're a prophecy buff, and so are probably so many of your listeners. And I have an identical twin brother, and he showed me a book in the early 80s. And even though I was raised Christian, I kind of got brainwashed in high school and beyond that, and kind of lost my way. And he came along, and I think most of your listeners might remember this book, but he said, you need to read this book. And it was The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. And I still have a copy of that, and I'm still a fan of Hal Lindsey. And I read the book, and it just scared the crap out of me. And so from that point on, I decided, well, I want to find out whether or not this is legitimate. I want to know whether it's accurate, they're not making it up, and whether or not I can find this information in the Bible. And so I started to read the Bible, and I started to read anything I could get my hands on, and that just led me back to Jesus and to Christianity. And I have been a fanatic about not only prophecy but my other passions as well, and doing my best on my quest to be the best person I can be. But I have to admit, I'm a sinner like most people, and I do stumble. But that's how I came back to Jesus, and it's amazing. And I thought, you know, wouldn't that be nice if somebody could actually write a book that might influence people? And that was one of the things that I wanted to do with this book, was to write a book that might influence people and talk about things that they may not be aware of, and aspects about the Bible they might have overlooked. And as I went through on the research on this, I started coming across so much material that I didn't know or didn't believe was in the genre. And so to be able to bring so much new information to the genre and prophecy and how it all ties together and connect dots that I don't believe other writers have connected before. So it was all that sort of coming together at the same time. And
That's
so,
really, really cool.
yeah, so I mean that was in 1980 or 81. So you can imagine how long I've been on the path of researching prophecy and things like that, matching it up with history and mythology, which are my other passions.
That's awesome. 81, 3 years before I was born. But that's great. I mean, that's so cool, because that's why I love having guests like you on, because then I get to learn something. And that's to me, that's the best part of life in general, is just getting to learn and getting to serve. And I love that. So it's great to have a guest like you on that shares that same passion. Something else that I wanna address up front, because I know you unfortunately you've gotten a little bit of flack for this, and I don't think it's warranted or deserved, but I think that it's similar to, I recently, well, not too recently, but I wrote a book, Cherubim Chariots, where I got into other ancient texts, especially like ancient Hindu, texts and stuff like that, purely for, it's history. People have eyewitness accounts of things, but not for gospel. But I know, unfortunately, some people have thought that, and I don't think I think the people that say this haven't even read your book, because it's clear that's not what you were going for. But since you got into, you study some of those texts, that must mean that you're promoting it. And I know, as a gospel truth or something. And I know that's not true, but I want to give you the opportunity to, just say a brief couple sentences about that, just so people who aren't familiar with your book yet don't get put off right in the beginning of the show just because we bring up, Gnostic text or ancient Indian text or something like that.
Yeah, and the avenues that I researched, I mean, it really gets into the areas that I think a lot of people might find on very thin ice. And I have to tell you, it was concerning, and how would I handle it and everything like that. But what I wanted to do was, as I continued on the research, I seemed to see these same stories that were popping up over and over and over and over and over, and they were consistent with the Bible from a macro level and a directional level, but from a different perspective. So either from polytheism or from secret societies, it matters not where it came from. They were telling a very, very similar story, but from their perspective. And so I wanted to bring that information out so that people could see that this is a very, very common story right around the world. And I also wanted to make sure that I could let those societies or religions or scriptures speak for themselves, and not sort of try and twist those words or anything, so that it could be considered accurate. Because everything that I put in the book, I believe, is also weighed, measured, and balanced against the accuracy of what the Bible says. And so there's really nothing in there that is contradicting what the Bible is saying. And you may find it challenging. You may find it that I've never thought of that. You may even find it disturbing. But everything that I have in the book is also backed up by the Bible. And so everything is measured against the Bible. So if anybody has any fears of that, please don't. And if anybody has any fears that I lost my soul in reading some of those items, many of them were interesting, lots were not. But no, I remain a Christian 100%. And I'm so much of a contrarian, I'll go out of the way and say that if somebody has read the Quran and is Muslim, I don't understand why they didn't become Christian after reading the Quran. It's mind-boggling. Right. It's absolutely mind-boggling, and that's the message of the Quran. So again, I'm not going to support Islam here in any fashion, or the fascists or the religion organizations. But what I will say is that all that, reading those other religions, it just made me more of a Christian, more sound in my beliefs. There's nothing that I'm transposing from those beliefs into my beliefs. I just use them for context and to demonstrate that there's a very common narrative out in the world that I think people need to learn about.
Yeah, and I totally agree, and I take that same stance when I look into other ancient texts as well. In my books, I handled it more, kind of like you know, I think that people had real experiences with real things, and they wrote them down. And I mean, especially in the Vedic texts, there's a lot of that. And in my book, I focused on Vimanas and stuff like that. But you know, we can accept that people had experience with things and beings. We don't have to say that they're God, or that they're, you know, that they replace God, or, you know, we don't have to go that far with it at all. But just accepting that these may not all be, you know, fairy tales, in the sense that somebody just sat down and made it all up. You know, I think people actually had real experiences with things, and they just probably didn't interpret it right. But you know, and we can look at that, and like you said, we compare it against the Bible to get the correct interpretation. So, but yeah, I love your research style, and the way that you approach this book. But yeah, I wanted to get that out of the way, just in case anybody read anything on, you know, Amazon, or if they read what the book was about. And, you know, I didn't want anybody to be scared off when they read like Islamic texts, or, you know, anything like that. So I'm glad that we got we got that. Now the book is called The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and at about 800 pages, it's quite a book. It's fantastic. Can you give us a brief summary of the book, like what led you to write this?
Well, a brief summary of the book is the Genesis 6 Conspiracy is a 6,000 year investigation, a connect the dots investigation into how secret societies and the Nephilim and the mystical religions that rose around the Nephilim and the secret societies and the ancient knowledge partnered to bring about the first apocalypse known as the flood. How those three organizations and descendants of them crossed the flood, how they affected things like Babel and Sodom and Gomorrah and the conquest, and how they imprinted our history all the way to the present time, what they're doing today, and how they plan on bringing about the end time, inclusive of the universal religion, world government, and the Antichrist.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's all stuff that I know is right up my alley, and most, if not all, the audience of this show. You know, what's really cool about this book too is it brings up a lot of really unique elements. And that is kind of rare on the topic of the Nephilim, because so much has been written about it. But you do a really good job. Can you go through some of the more unique elements, and what the audience can expect to find that's unique about your book as compared to some of the others that might be out there?
Well, first of all, I think that people will be very, very surprised. Maybe not all, but most will be surprised that whether or not you're talking about Freemasonry accounts from before the flood, which they have an extensive record of, whether or not you're looking at Greek mythology or the Vedas and the various holy scriptures out of India, or the Popol Vuh from the Quiché Maya and the Aztecs and the Central Americans. It doesn't matter where you go around the world, they all tell the same story, what happened before the flood. A different perspective from a polytheist perspective, but they tell the same story about creation, and they tell the same story about how humankind went wrong, how they participated in helping to produce the giants. Whether they're not always called Nephilim, they're called Titans and Anunnaki and many, many other names around the world, and how these giants helped corrupt the ancient world and cause the flood. And so I think that's one of the first unique testimonies that it brings together for a lot of people. Some of the other unique things is that this is a conspiracy that has been going on since before the flood, and is the same conspiracy and the same organizations that have worked throughout history and are working today. And they all tell about this complete conspiracy all the way through the 6,000 years. And none of this is, I think, documented or connected. And what I particularly do is I bring in how and where mysticism arose, how it crossed the flood as well, what its relationship is with the giants, and when we get into the giants, and in particularly the giants, it's the descendants of the giants, it's the bloodlines of the giants, and how they have survived, at least from their perspective, how they've survived, and the bloodlines that produced the royal houses that again have kept their genealogies throughout all of history and prehistory, producing all of the major royal families around the world, and how they still control the world today. And so if that is of interest, people, and how those bloodlines are related to the modern versions of mysticism, whether we're talking about Gnosticism or New Age or Theosophy or Eastern religions, or about modern secret societies like the Illuminati or the Rosicrucians or the Bilderbergers, or all of these different groups that they spawn, I think your readers will find this a very interesting read.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most, in my discovery of the Nephilim and study into Genesis 6, when I really first started getting started, is how much important information is really in those genealogies. And when we go to Sunday school and church, we usually just skip over those. I've never heard a sermon when I was I grew up Baptist, so when I was going to the Baptist church, I never heard a sermon on like the genealogies of Genesis or anything. But there's a lot of really important information there. And something that I want to ask too, you talked about a connection between mysticism, secret societies, and the Nephilim. What is the connection? What do those three have in common?
Well, let's talk about that. So everybody knows in the Bible we begin with Adam and Eve, and what secret societies and mysticisms and these other religions believed is that they received information from heaven, whether that was legitimate information or illegitimate. But they believe it was legitimate information from God while they were in Eden. But after the banishment, two branches formed, one being the branch of Cain and one being the branch of Seth. And that Cain took this message, and through his first son Enoch, they corrupted these sciences, and they added to it other information from the dark angels and created religions around it to secret this information that seemingly they developed to levels of unbelievable proportions, and to such proportions that they felt it had to be kept secret for two reasons. One, it might destroy the world. Two, they didn't feel that the mundane average human being was worthy enough to have that information. And so they initiated societies and have done so ever since.
Yeah, definitely. I want to, as soon as I can stop stuttering, I want to backtrack a little bit. You said something about sacred sciences, and
Yes.
that's a point that I found really intriguing in the book. What are the seven sacred sciences, and can you go into that?
Yeah, basically everybody's going to be fairly familiar with those sciences, and it's geometry, which is the fifth science, commonly known as masonry within the craft. It's astronomy, it's music, it's science in general, it's the arts, it's basic human knowledge that's broken down into seven, and arithmetic, obviously, into seven different groups. But it's what they were able to do with this knowledge that is the scary part. And they actually believe that they built the pyramids and other monuments like that around the world before the flood, and that they took this society to a level probably similar to in technology to what we have today, and maybe developed in different areas and a little bit differently right now. And so they believe it is the secrets to the universe. And so when you hear about it today, it's the seven liberal arts, and you'll hear that through Greek mythology as well. It's the same sciences, but it's what they did with them that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. What the Nephilim and flood narratives of Genesis 6? How are those connected to other giant mythologies of giants throughout the world, and polytheistic religions around the world. Why are those testimonies so important to this type of research?
Well, it shows that this is just not a one-off story in the Bible, and it was so important that it was recorded and part of the memories of all cultures in the world. So something that it's like the great one world myth. It's our common legacy and heritage, and it's like the ancients are whispering to us that we need to go back and learn about prehistory. What happened, what caused the first apocalypse, because as we all know, or most people of prophecy know, that the end time will be like the days of Noah. And so I think when our Messiah says, learn about the days of Noah, we ought to take that with the veracity and importance that his words speak to, and learn how that's going to be important to bring about the second apocalypse, this time by fire. And so if Nephilim and secret societies and mysticism was a big part of the first apocalypse, they're likely going to be part of this apocalypse.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. And I in a lot of my studies, I get into like quantum physics and stuff. I'm really interested in that. But there's a lot of parallels in that theology. Not that the science itself is a theology, but it's almost become that, because the scientists that teach this stuff, they don't just stick with the observation. They get into their own interpretation, but they teach their interpretation as if it's just universal truth. So like, documentaries like What the Bleep Will Do, or What the Bleep Do We Know, they'll have, some science in there, but then they'll say, well, this proves that God can't be a personal God. He's like a universal force, like in Star Wars or something.
Right.
And they'll try to say that, the science says that. So, I mean, we're almost getting into this, new mysticism, or really new age nowadays, in science, and it's progressing more and more like that. And that is something I want to touch on as well. But before
let's talk a little bit just quickly about one of the
Sure.
things that one of their sciences that they developed afterwards to help guide and control. So reason over faith, as they like to refer to it as, reason over knowledge. And that is the art of philosophy, which they believe, and it's actually part of their religion. They've just called it a science. And so that science, that the science of philosophy, or the religion of philosophy, dictates how all of science ought to be interpreted.
Yeah, and we see that a lot nowadays. It's really rare, probably near impossible, to find physicists that, for one, makes any sense. It's almost like they speak a different language.
Yes.
but that can actually separate the philosophy from the actual findings. I mean, a really big example of that was when the Higgs boson was discovered, and it was called the God particle. And the particle itself, I mean, it's an interesting particle, but it has nothing to, the only thing that it has to do with God is what every particle has to do with God, in that he created it. It's not proof of God. It's not proof against God. It's not, it's not anything in those regards, in a philosophical, way of thinking. That particle is not anything special to the other particles. Now, scientifically speaking, it's phenomenal. It's an important discovery, but it got that label, God particle. So when that came out, there were a lot of Christians thinking it was proof of God. There were Christians thinking scientists were making fun of us. They didn't really know what to do with it. Unfortunately, that's what happens when philosophy gets mixed in with science.
Sure. And people should not find this surprising, because if you look at the rise of modern education and modern science, it goes back really to the birth of the Royal College in England. And the Royal College, also known as the Royal Society, is also known as the Invisible College. And this society, this organization, all of the education institutions still report to today as the parent organization. It was formed by the secret societies. It was formed by Rosicrucians and Freemasonry to pay tribute to the great architect of the universe, which is another name they use for Lucifer. And so if And I'll cover that off in my book as people get deeper into the book. So we should not find this surprising. We should not find it surprising that science is inundated with symbols. Let's say the medical association with the almost Hermes motif with the snake around the what they would call the tree of Eden in their belief system, or that there are initiations or things that they swear to, whether you're in engineering or whatever. This is all part of the same belief system. So people being educated there are being brainwashed with a philosophy which is actually a religion.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And as much as I love science, it is becoming, and really, I think always has been to a certain extent, a religion. And you know, it's kind of it's unnerving the directions that it's taking nowadays, and the way that they justify some of the things that they're doing, especially in like transgenics and you know the transhumanist movement and things like that. They're doing some of the most ungodly things based on their own man-made philosophies that has no real bearing on anything outside of themselves.
Well,
so yeah, I definitely, yeah.
And all of that is just another form of the Nephilim doctrine, whether or not it's a new man by bioengineering, or new man by genetics or DNA manipulation, or fallen angels copulating with women to create hybrids, or DNA manipulation by aliens, or aliens creating hybrids. It is the same philosophy, and it is the same philosophy that they were trying to do in Germany with the new man and the super race, because it's the same belief system. And again, I'll spend a complete chapter on the Third Reich and lay that all out for people so that they understand it's the same story and the same belief system and the same end goal. The Third Reich was about bringing on 1,000-year reign, just as a copy of the millennial reign in the Bible. And the new age that they're trying to bring about is another millennial reign as well. It's just they believe that they're going to win the battle, and they're going to have their belief system as opposed to the Christian belief system or the Jewish belief system or monotheism. So again, it's really important to learn from history, and I think that's the message of the Messiah.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, and especially with you know what happened in Genesis, all this brought the flood, and so if we were to learn from history, we should see that something like that, you know, this time by fire, and that brings up an interesting question too. I think I've anytime we do like a Nephilim show on the Sharpening, I always ask this because I'm always interested to know what people think because it's a big mystery. I think I've heard about 3 pretty good theories about it, but I'm curious what you think. How do you believe that the giants or the Nephilim survived the flood? Because we see that they make a reappearance. You know, the 3 main views that I've heard is you know that somehow the genes survived on the flood, maybe through one of Noah's son's wives. The other one is that the fallen angels came down and did it again, or multiple incursions. And then the other one is that there may have been some sort of genetic tampering, or you know, after the flood, because the world would have been littered with you know bodies of dead giants, you know, we would assume. So maybe they manipulated the genes and cloned them or something. What do you think? Any of those do you think are possible, or do you have a different idea? What's your opinion?
Well, I'm going to cover that in the book and in significant detail. My gut feeling is that giants did survive the flood, and I'm going to go into the book and explain that. I do leave open the possibility that there was a second impassioned violation against the laws of creation, and so they were created afterwards. That's certainly possible, because if you read Genesis 6, you could interpret it both ways. They either survived the flood or they were recreated afterwards. And so that to me is pretty speculative as to how that happened. And so I wanted to be able to try and answer that question. And so if we're talking about an impassioned second violation, Sodom and Gomorrah comes to the surface as one of the most obvious answers. And I'll bring in support from the Gnostic religions to suggest that there was a second impassioned violation at Sodom and Gomorrah, which was one of the reasons why Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed, and also bring how Nephilim were related to the Sodom and Gomorrah narrative that people may not be aware of. But I'll also talk about from not only the biblical perspective, but other mythologies and religions, how giants survived the flood. And most people believe that nobody survived the flood, except that, let's just start with Og as an example. And if you look at Deuteronomy 3 or Joshua 12, he was noted as the last of the Rephaites. Well, that's not possible, or the Bible is in contradiction. And I don't believe the Bible is in contradiction. And so Jewish mythology believes Og did survive the flood and have a lot of legends. Lewis Ginsburg writes great legends from the Hebrews, and Og is one of those prominent figures in there. So that's certainly one possibility. And why wasn't he the last of the Rephaites? Well, even when we get into Goliath, and I'll connect Goliath to being a Rephaite and being a Nephilim, is he was considered a Rephaite at that time. And because Og wasn't killed at that time, there's a lot of speculation that he was actually a descendant or an ancestor of Goliath. So the wording is very, very odd. And I think that really points to one suggestion that giants survived the flood, as Unger's Bible Dictionary suggests that Og was also a survivor of the flood. And let's remember that Og had a brother named Sihon, and so that means he survived the flood because he was a brother, if that's the case. Then we get into all of these other anomalies in the Old Testament of unaccounted for peoples. The Rephaites or the Anakites, the Zamzanites, the Avites, all of these different people that are not in the Table of Nations. So why are they not in the Table of Nations? We're led to believe by standard Christian dogma that everybody who survived the flood then begat from either Noah or his 3 sons. Well, these names are nowhere to be found. And then there's other peoples, not only than the giants, but there's the Hittites that are thought to be giants as well, and the Hivites and the Horites. Where did the Horites come from? They are in the Table of Nations with the descendants of Esau, but those descendants of Seir, they come out of nowhere. Who is Seir? He is just inserted. How is that possible? I know it makes sense, and I'll cover off the connections to Seir and Esau as I go through the book, and particularly at the end of the book, but they just come out of nowhere. And then there's peoples like the Gershites and the Girgazites and the Kenizzites and the Kenites. All of these people come out of nowhere, and of course the infamous Amalekites. And I'll spend a lot of time on the Amalekites as well, tracing them back to being people that crossed the flood. So I think it's quite possibly both.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It very well could be. Yeah, and I agree with you. There's no, I don't believe there's any contradictions in the Bible either. So whatever the answer is, it should, flow through the whole thing. So that's why I'm always interested about that, to get people's take on it, because it is a big mystery. But yeah, it very well could be both. It makes a lot of sense.
Well, and I think
yeah.
Just sorry to interrupt. I don't
Sure.
think when I say that the Bible doesn't contradict itself. What I'm also saying, though, in tandem with that is that the Bible adds more information as you go. And
Yes.
So you have to be careful that just because it looks a little differently, if you look in the flood narrative, for example, and everybody thinks that all the animals, 2 of each kind, were taken. Well, all of a sudden then you read there's 7 of the clean animals taken. Well, that's not a contradiction. Yep. That's just additional information that's telling more about the story. And clearly the Bible can't be in contradiction if it says the Nephilim were both before and after the flood.
Yes, absolutely. So what kind of impact did the giants have on the post-flood world?
Well, we learn very quickly in Genesis that an incident at Babel happened. And in that incident, there's a city being built, and there's a tower being built, and we're also told something very, very odd. And that odd statement is that if working as one people with one language, there's nothing that they can't do. To paraphrase it, what is all this referring to? This is referring to the partnership between Nimrod and Hermes in the seven sacred sciences and the mysticism and the rise shortly after the flood and their partnership with Nephilim. And so this is a very, very important story because, again, it has so many allegories and inferences that are going to come about in the end time. So to me, it's very important to learn about prehistory. And so what happened right after the flood is you have Nimrod, who some people think was a giant. I'm going to make the case in the book that he's not, because Nimrod is in the Table of Nations in First Chronicles and Genesis. But his descendants are not. So now that's suggesting to me that he probably married into the Nephilim bloodline, and therefore his descendants were not listed thereafter. That's my rationale for that. But they partnered together to reestablish all the awful things that took place in prehistory. And then they also imprinted on Sodom and Gomorrah, as we talked about. But more importantly is after Babel, Nephilim, who were the kings and the potentates of the old world, usurped the kingships in the new world. And so in Chaldea, in Egypt, in Seir, with the Amalekites, the Mitanni dynasty, the Hittites, and all of the kingships around the world, they usurped. And they continued to survive with these dynasties, and they have impacted all of our history while partnering with mysticism and these sciences, and they continue to influence our world today. And these bloodlines from Nephilim survive today. And I'll make a case as we go through the book that I'll give good guidance to that these bloodlines will be the bloodlines of the Antichrist, and narrow that down to the families that will likely present the Antichrist.
Yeah, that's something that I've thought for a while too. That the Nephilim bloodlines are have a connection there, definitely. A really interesting thing that I love that you got into this in the book. How are dragons, berries, and snakes connected to the descendants of the giants?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And so in so many ways, and I'll try and explain some of it. So first thing I want just to underline, and everybody subconsciously knows it, that there are serpent images, cobra images, viper images, snake images in every society. And there's also the dragon. And people, and we're taught today that there's no evidence for the dragon. But it's very odd that you have this common sort of world myth that's everywhere, every continent, every culture knows about dragons. So let's just talk a little bit about that. So I'll make a case in the book that the angels, the dark angels who went to Mount Hermon and mated with human females were seraphim angels. And they were part of a group that a lot of your people will be aware of, known as the Watchers, and in Greek they were known as the Grigori. Well, seraphim angels, not only some references in the Bible, which only seraph is in the Bible in Isaiah, refers to snakes. But seraphim angels were thought to look like snakes, like vipers. They had a face of a viper, and I'll bring some very parallel and biblical references in the book to substantiate that. And their offspring, the Nephilim, looked just like them. So when you see in other cultures all of these images of gods that look like snakes and giants that look like snakes and all of this imagery, they were just producing art and keeping a record of their gods and the Nephilim. And so if you look at now the seraphim angel that has the face of a viper, and you put wings on that, what do you have? You have a dragon. And if people look at the Eden incident, we look at the serpent losing its hands and its feet and its voice, and had to crawl on the ground thereafter. Well, what's important to notice on that is that there's a lot of belief out there that there was more than just serpents that had hands and legs like like a crocodile would have, or feet, let's say 4 feet. But in prehistory, there's mythology that this animal actually walked on 2 feet and was bigger than a human being and was fairly intelligent. And I'll cover that off in the book as well. But that some of these forms of serpents before the Eden incident also had wings, which again would be an animal form of the dragon. So I think when we look at the dragon imagery, and we understand that the Nephilim looked just like them in the beginning, and that they usurped the kingships and the religions in both prehistory and after the flood, it makes sense that there's this dragon and serpent imagery everywhere. And if we look at the influence that these societies and mysticism have had throughout the millennia, again, it's not surprising to me that we see this imagery in fairy tales and in literature and in all of our entertainment, because they're the ones keeping this genealogy and information alive in different forms other than the genealogies. And people don't understand that this is not done just to entertain people. This is done to brainwash people in preparation for the end game so that they'll find it acceptable. And so when we look at all of these different aspects, you shouldn't be surprised that Dracula is telling the same story. Drinking blood, which was a typical Nephilim portrait, to keep them immortal, which the Nephilim originally were and want to be immortal, that the Christian church or the Catholic church is their mortal enemy. All of these allegories are encoded in, and if you walk through any of this type of literature, fairy tale or otherwise, what seemingly is innocent, what is seemingly outside the box, they're going to have the same religion and allegories and genealogies and secrecies in there. So if you get into King Arthur, if you get into Robin Hood, you're talking about the same thing over and over and over again.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, one thing I wanted to ask too, do you think that there's do you think these things are still presenting themselves to people? Because there's a lot of supposed alien encounters that they'll abductees or experiencers or contactees, whatever you want to call it, they will claim that they have seen reptilian beings. Do you think there's a connection there?
Well, there's definitely a connection there, whether or not these are shape-shifting beings or not that would just take a human form. I guess that's possible. That would have to be fallen angels, in my opinion, who in a lot of beliefs have the shape-shifting capability. And I guess if there's really only one biblical reference where I'd say two, where that could be. One would be as if Lucifer, Satan, actually morphed into a snake to go into Eden. And the second one would be at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, where the angels that were sent, the three of them, looked like human beings, and Abraham did not realize they were not human beings. So there's a belief that in the physical world they can change their form, and they can also change sex, which means that they could have produced, let's say, a more angelic type of Nephilim that would be the lower gods in the polytheist pantheon, because all of the pantheons are the same. All comes from the same belief system and the same dark angels. So that can answer sort of that aspect of it. What was the question again?
I got on it was rant, about the. So, yeah. Oh no, that's been I say a lot in the show. If this wasn't called the sharpening, it would be called the tangent, because the show has me as a host, and that's what I do. So that's total. I think he answered it though. It was about the reptilian race.
Oh, okay, yeah. Aliens. So there's another aspect I wanted to go down on that. Thanks for putting me back on track. So let's bring in the fairy equation.
Yeah.
And so I'll talk about fairies in the book significantly. And again, it's one of those things that comes up in all sorts of literature and entertainment. And again, for everybody, understand that that's there for a reason. And so in the fairy mythology, there were 4 different kinds of fairies. And so if you're into Tuatha De Danann and Celtic mythology, some of this is going to be fairly familiar with you. So there are the opalescent fairies, that came to this planet from somewhere else and rebelled against God. And so they are translucent. You can sort of see through them, and they're a shining being. And then they produced another fairy through mating with human females, and they became the earthly fairies, who were shining beings as well. And for people that don't know, the original Nephilim, their eyes shone. They actually glowed, and it was part of what made them scary. And you'll see that. That's why you see that in science fiction movies, let's say like Stargate series. That's why their eyes will glow. Okay, that's that same idea being kept alive again. And so below that, there are two sets of little people. And people will know the little people like the leprechauns or the gnolls, and there's several different subsets. And in the one set, there's 3 sets of little people, and inside one of those little people is a sect called the Gray Neighbors. Now these now these Gray Neighbors have the same physical description as the Gray Aliens. These little fairies also had flying machines, and they kidnapped people. And they were looking to reproduce with them to regenerate their gene pool, and they did other scientific things, and then they would return the people, and the people, it would say in fairy lore, after a fortnight, so let's say about 40 days, as I recall, a fortnight, and they would not have a memory of this. So I provide a description of fairy abduction in the book. And I think people find it startling as to how close it is to the aliens. So I think there's a connection in this all the way through. I know a lot of people believe that aliens are demons or fallen angels with that shape-shifting capability. That's certainly a possibility. I'm thinking that these little beings have been around since prehistory, and they also somehow survived the flood. Because again, in fairy mythology, you have these portals called knolls and mounds and fairy mounds, and in the Grail lore, the ladies of the lake protect the entrance to the portals to the other world. And in the alien mythology, many believe that UFOs come through these portals. So there's a direct connection in here all the way through. I think demons are here. They're the bodiless giants, where they're of the immortal first generation that weren't permitted into heaven and didn't go to sleep, and they continue to possess people and cause mayhem. But I also believe that these little people could possibly be beings that survived. And if you look at Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and you see all of these little fairies and elves and things, it's quite a big part of the different sort of races that are in that story. And at the end of Tolkien's trilogy is these people are seen going away on a boat because it's the time of humankind. And that, again, is telling me that they're telling us messages of prehistory that they want to keep alive, that the people that they've enlightened or illuminated or educated or whatever know exactly what they're talking about, that somehow these beings also survived. So that's my take on it.
Wow, that's really interesting. That yeah, you just kind of blew me away there. That's I've actually never heard that before, the connection with the fairies and gnomes and things. Yeah, that's really interesting. That's something I've always been interested in, was some of these cryptozoology. I can't even say that. Cryptozoology. Some of the some of the things that eschatological. That's another one I have a hard time
I won't even try that one.
Always been really interested in that, and we even, the last episode we did on Bigfoot possibly being an extra dimensional, angelic or fallen angel being, we got into some of that. So, but yeah, that's an area of the book that I love that you got into. I've always been interested in that, and it really does make a lot of sense. Yeah, go ahead.
And there'll be another aspect of the fairy, not only allegory, but the fairy bloodline that I'm going to connect through in the book, in particular as we get into the last parts of the book. And I'll distinguish between the dragon bloodline and the fairy bloodline. And I'll show how those branches fanned out and how they've rejoined. And one is the male patriarch bloodline, which is the dragon bloodline, and the fairy bloodline is the matriarch or the female bloodline of inheritance. And I'll bring those together.
Yeah, I definitely want to hear more about that because you talk about the in the book the post-Diluvian dynasties. How did these how were the early dominant dynasties? How they affect our history to where we find ourselves today?
Well, if you look at the main kingship dynasties that most people are aware of, so everybody's aware of the Egyptian dynasty, and so that's one major effect. Obviously, the descendants of Nimrod, and after Babel, where he went into Mesopotamia, into in basically the father of the Assyrians, father of the Persians, and so those dynasties grew up. And then within the Middle East, you have the Hittite dynasty, which was, you know, disappeared, say somewhere between 1200 and 1400 BCE, depending on who you're talking to. And certainly the Philistines give them a good whooping as they expropriated their land in the Middle East. But the Mitanni dynasty was also a very familiar one, and these dynasties would intermarry to keep their bloodlines pure. And if they wanted to start a new dynasty, they had to make sure that they started it with an ennobled bloodline of a female. And so if they wanted to export a new dynasty somewhere, it would start with the matriarchy. Even though everybody thinks of the patriarchy as the dominant one, you have to keep in mind their belief system is both male and female. And it's all throughout their religions. When you look at it, whether it's Isis and Osiris, it's male and female, it's dualistic all the way through in every aspect. And so that has a very, very important. So these dynasties survived right through to the time of, the Greek Empire. And even the Greeks make, and I'll cover this off in the book as well, about Alexandria being linked back to giants. And the Greeks, it may be a mythology, and he may have been just a dictator that took over. But again, this whole thing dominated all of the major empires. And as these original dynasties kind of disappeared, I'll track through where they went to. And so if you look at the Egyptian dynasty, the last one that is of noteworthiness is the Amarna dynasty. And that's King Tut, and that's Akhenaten, and that's Skoda, and that's Nefertiti, and I think as other people will pronounce it. So why was that so important? Is because that dynasty disappeared, and where did they go? And I'll cover that off in the end of the book. But they didn't die out, or at least their belief system says that they didn't die out. So where did they go? These bloodlines survived to repopulate the dynasties in Europe. Now, this doesn't necessarily cover off the Red Dragon dynasties of China, although you can make a case that they migrated out of the Middle East and in that direction. But there's a separate bloodline in there. I didn't follow that one because the book is long enough as it is. I kept it more for the Western side of civilization. But understand there's a very strong Red Dragon dynasty, as they call it, in Asia. And so these dynasties survived to make most of the kingships that we're aware of through modern history. And most of the power being transferred back and forth would be either a Vatican-dominated kingship or from these dragon kingships. So when you look at history, look at it from a view of there's two different sides with warfare going on all of the time. And these dynasties succeeded in, for the most part, keeping their royal bloodlines on the throne all of the time. And so if you do, let's say, get a usurping of the Plantagenet, that was in England, and that was by Henry VIII, and you wonder why he's so maligned. Well, he may have been a bad person, but that's not the real motive. It's because he would be coming from as an outsider, whether it's Vatican sponsored or not. And so if you look at let's say Shakespeare, who wrote a lot about genealogies and kingships, he is documenting these bloodlines as well, even at that time. And he is not nice on the Tudors. I mean, he takes them takes them down in his writings, and he, whether it's Richard III or whoever else, or King Lear that he's talking about, or Hamlet, he's holding those bloodlines in a completely different sort of respect level. And so these bloodlines may not have kingships dominating the world today, but these families control what goes on in the world today. And so we may not recognize them as kings, but some of them we will. And understand that you need to follow the King of Jerusalem title. This is the title of the Antichrist, and it's part of their bloodline legacy, and they'll declare themselves, that the Antichrist will declare himself as the King of Jerusalem, and also putting in the Benjamite lines of that inheritance that Joshua had originally given back during the Exodus. And I'll cover that off in the book as well.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. How does what is the relationship between the descendants of giants and the Antichrist? How do these bloodlines play into that?
Well, because these bloodlines have been intermixed and ennobled and tracked all the way through, they're going to use these genealogies to establish the pedigree of the Antichrist, and that he goes way back and back to these fallen giants. You have to remember, he's the Antichrist, so he's going to have a completely different pedigree than what Jesus has. But they will also, and again, if you go into literature, you're going to learn about this as well in terms of modern literature. When we talk about, let's say, the Da Vinci Code, they're going to find a way to mix in, I don't believe, rightly, I don't think they can actually prove it, these will be falsified genealogies, that Jesus survived, had children, and has intermarried into these bloodlines. And so they've been keeping these bloodlines purified. They keep 3 possible Antichrist figures indoctrinated and ready to go all of the time. And when the time is right, they will select one of these and he will step forward.
Wow, yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I love that you get into that topic in the book, because I love Bible prophecy, and obviously the Antichrist is a big piece of that. Something that we do on the show, we have viewer questions, and we are at that time.
Okay.
For the audience, if you want the chance to send in questions to guests, you can go to Facebook and ask to join the Sharpening Facebook group, and I'll happy to accept you, as long as you don't have a fake account, because we got enough of those as it is. But before any show, I'll pin a post at the top that says who the guest is going to be, what the show is going to be about, and give you, the audience, the opportunity to ask questions. So again, you can go to the Sharpening Facebook group to do that. We do have, well, actually, we have 2 questions. The first one I missed. It was from earlier, but I'm glad that I caught it. Timothy asks, you label yourself as a Christian contrarian. What does the term Christian contrarian mean?
Well, it means that I don't come by my views as a standard Christian dogma that's taught in the churches. I know there are so many different dogmas and things being taught out there, so I let the Bible speak for itself. And if I don't understand something in the Bible, I'm going to research it until I think I have that understanding and back it up. So it's a very contrarian view that I prefer to read the scripture and understand it for what it says. And I know there's more learned people out there than probably me, for sure, but I'm not going to listen to what somebody tells me. I will, but I'm going to check it out. And if it doesn't totally add up, then I'm probably going to dismiss that perspective.
Amen. I'm right there with you. I'm the same way. You know, I grew up in a Baptist church, and it was it was nice, it was loving and everything, but there were a lot of questions I had that just didn't have answers, or even really any kind of solid answers to it. And it left me curious, and eventually, and this isn't the church's fault, this is my own fault. Eventually it led me down the path of New Age. You know, I got into New Age theology, trying to find answers to some of the real, some of the stranger questions that, you know, that I had that they didn't want to touch in the church. But through that, coming out of that, and then really dedicating my life to Jesus, and doing what I'm doing now, that did lead me to, instead of just accepting what tradition, you know, what church tradition tells me, I wanted to see what the Bible said, because there are a lot of differences in what church tradition will say,
Yes.
as opposed, you know, compared with the Bible. So I am right there with you, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that stance and that tactic. It's the same one that I take in all my research as well. Michael asks, do you believe they are building an army of Nephilim giants and monsters to do battle with the Lord at Armageddon now in the deep underground military bases?
Well, nobody really knows what they're doing down there, but I believe the question is what do I believe? What I do believe is they're doing a number of nefarious things. I do believe they are working on DNA modifications and biotechnology and things like that. I'm not convinced that they've got giants ready to go. But I do believe they are trying to create a new man, and I do believe they are preparing to make a stand that's not that far away. I don't think there's giants down there at this point in time.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's definitely interesting to look into, though, especially if you look into things like the Denver airport and the possible or supposed base that's supposed to be under there, or the Dulce base. Lots of really interesting things out there. I don't know how truthful any of it is, but it's definitely interesting.
They're
So
preparing. It's for what?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, what is your view of that? Like, what do you think the whole end time scenario? How is it going to play out? What's going to be, uh, what's going to be the thing that they use to deceive everyone? Is it going to be like a fake alien thing, or is it going to be some kind of political takeover of the world? How do you see all of this? It's kind of a big question, but how do you see all of this kind of unfolding?
It's going to be some of each in there. So we're going to have an alien aspect to it. All depends on how they want to present it, but likely an alien aspect that we're just one of many species sitting at the galactic table, like Star Wars, like Babylon 5, like Star Trek, in that there are two sides to this war, and this side is for freedom in terms of the aliens and stuff and fighting against the evil God. Because you have to remember that these people believe that Lucifer and God are equals.
Yeah.
And that they actually have a chance to win this, and this is an ongoing fight. So we're going to be asked to fight for our rebellion. That's going to be this underlying tone. So there's going to be an alien involvement. And even if we look at some of prophecy, we read in Daniel and Revelation where this war reaches into the heavens. And so that's a bit allegorical, but I think that's a reference that there's an alien presence that's going to be utilized in that. We also have to understand that the fallen angels are going to be released in the end days out of the abyss. Yeah. Where they were locked away before. So that's going to be an aspect in terms of Nephilim and how they work with possible aliens and the governments and the secret societies and all these other things going on. So all of this is coming together. We can see that coming together, I think. But if we look from history, whether we look at prehistory or Babel, we saw that first there was the universal religion. And so that should come together first. And the false prophet will stem out of that. So whether we're talking about Enoch, son of Cain, not of Seth, and people need to understand there were two Enochs in prehistory, and they were not the same, and there are different books surviving written by each, that there is that as a false prophet, and the potentates through the Nephilim that came along, just like we'll have descendants of Nephilim and potentates that are going to form world government, but you have to have the universal religion first, in my opinion. And just like at Babel, we had Hermes. He was the false prophet that was that was leading the universal religion there. So we have to have the universal church, then we have to have the false prophet. That will lead to, because of the power of the universal religion, to 10 empires being set up. just as Daniel talks about, just as the Club of Rome has planned. And that's their job, to bring about these 10 empires. And I look at those as trading blocks, economic zones, powers of influence, not separate countries, as so many prophetic people have looked at in the past. So they'll have 10 different empires in the world that form this world government. And it will be the Antichrist that negotiates this world treaty. He won't be totally known. Christians will recognize him as the Antichrist, but he won't be crowned Antichrist until halfway through the end time. And so there's a distinct order of how this needs to have happen. And I know it's difficult to believe that there'll be universal religion, but you know, that's what Revelation tells us. And that the Antichrist is going to rise that quickly to power, and he's not going to have to do it by war. He's just going to usurp at the middle of the tribulation 3 of those empires, and expect those to be the Western democracies, in my opinion, because he's going to distribute the plunder, which is another word for wealth distribution. And so all of this has played out in the past, and that's why I have one of the chapters that is named, as I transition from the old part of the history of the Nephilim into modern times, nothing new is under the sun. We've seen this before, we're going to see it again. So we're going to see an ever-growing movement to bring down borders and attacks against nationalism, Christians and monotheists being slowly set aside as the mundane, the people that will not be permitted to join the new age because we're not worthy and we're incapable of evolving. This will only be reserved for what they would say, some people might say, is the RH bloodline, but they also refer to it as the gene of Isis, that there's a particular gene, what they believe that they have. These will be the people that will take over their new age, not the regular people, and it's usually the rich. So, but right. That's a sort of a broad stroke is how I see things coming together. And look for it to come together through, you know, the slow movement of the negotiation of free trade treaties, technology. But then, as with all prophecy, in my opinion, is for it to happen very quickly in short steps with cataclysmic events. So you can imagine an economic disaster or other disasters that will unite humankind, nuclear war, but there'll be something that comes along that speeds the process up in a very short period of time.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think we're even starting to see that in our country nowadays. What do you think that that the one world religion is going to be? Do you think that it's going to be one of the religions on earth now, say Islam or New Age, that's going to rise and take over? Or do you think it's going to be something else entirely?
It's the old religion of Babylon, Babel. Enoch. They've got moles all through Christianity today. The Gnostics are everywhere. Everybody knows what's going on in Rome. Rome is going to be the center for this religion, and it will take a tribute out of every transaction that takes place. It'll be that powerful when it comes about. And so we're going to see some things that influence the Roman Church very, very quickly. If St. Malachi is correct in his prophecy of popes, then we are on the last pope. And incidentally, he's not only called the anti-pope, but also the black pope. And so if Malachi is accurate, and it's not canonized, I recognize that. But the black pope is the leader of the Jesuits. And we have a Jesuit who is the leader, and the white pope is the leader of the Vatican. So we have a black pope and a white pope leading the Vatican. But what also people don't know, anti-pope also means replacement pope. And so for the first time, we have 2 popes. And Benedict was replaced. So if we're going to start seeing a speeding up, then we've got the right pope, because this is supposed to be the last pope before the false prophet. I know people think Francis, in many aspects, is either the false prophet or the Antichrist. He's not. He's too old, I think. And we need a transition. Look for the Mary apparitions out of Catholicism to rise to significance in the Roman Church as the whole thing sort of takes over Catholicism, and I'm not anti-Catholic. My parents, not my parents, my wife's parents, and are Catholics, and very strong Catholics. They're good people. This influence is just going to usurp the church and become the universal church. And we know it is the Roman church because it sits on 7 hills in Revelation, and there's only one city that sits on 7 hills. So this will be the religion. So it will be mysticism that takes over Roman Catholicism, that uses cataclysms. And if you look at Medjugorje on the Mary apparitions that come back around, these children were indoctrinated in the 90s. They will go out with messages to the world to convert to one religion, repent, or a cataclysm will happen. And there'll be 10 of these messages. I think this is going to play a significant part in making that shift to bring about the universal religion. And so it will be mysticism inside a broken Christianity. How they break Christianity, go to the Da Vinci Code and all of the writings and the Holy Grail legends, and you'll learn all about it, is they are going to try and convince people that Jesus did not die on the cross. And therefore, as Paul said, if he did not die on the cross, then Christianity is a lie and our religion falls. And that's how they're going to go after it. They're going to go after Paul, and they're going to go after the resurrection and the virgin birth. And so they're going to say that part of these descendants through Joseph of Arimathea taking the Grail children married into these Nephilim bloodlines that I'll lay out through you in the book. So this is how Christianity will fall, or at least be controlled, although those who are faithful are going to be persecuted, but we'll know what's going on. And we'll need to be patient and endure. But Christianity, as we know it, will change, and the moles inside the church and all these other things going around will make that happen.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's definitely something that we need to keep watching out for. What are some of the other things that like secret societies are doing today to prepare us for what's to come? You know, to deceive us or to break apart the church, or how do the secret societies fit into the whole plan here?
Well, the secret societies, they are controlling all of these different aspects, and there's a hierarchy to these secret societies. So people are familiar with Freemasonry, but they're just one aspect, and they really get involved on the political and sort of business aspect and start selecting people to be initiated to become illuminated. And once they're illuminated, they then become the Illuminati. So they have organized groups like the Skull and Bones and the Bilderbergers, the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, Club of Rome, all these different organizations that are trying to move the world together and to form a world government. So that's the political aspect. The secret societies also control the banking arm. And the banking arm, and I'll talk a lot about the Rothschilds, they're only the visible part, but they were created, the Rothschilds, as the banking arm. And if you look at what's going on in the world today, if you look at some of the last bastions of countries that don't have a Federal Reserve Bank, let's say like Iraq, or Afghanistan and Iran and Korea, I think there was like 7 that were left that didn't have a reserve bank. They're finding ways to overthrow those countries and change their political stature so that the banks can get control of those remaining countries, and they'll continue to fall as we sort of march towards global occupation, as Gary Kaw said in the 90s. And so they are active. They have trust groups that influence all of our education. These are tax-funded trust groups, and I'll document this in the book, as Gary Kaw did, that fund the propagandizing and brainwashing of education and preparing people for the elite. So they're behind all of that with their soldiers. You have to understand, this is a Leviathan that not only has many arms, but many heads. And I don't use that allegory lightly, because that's a dragon type allegory. They are everywhere. They are so well organized. They are moving every aspect. If you look at anything that's going on that can cross borders, for example, they're organizing it, and it's coming from the left. And it's coming from the left because that's part of their belief system. And again, I'll document that from that political aspect in the book. And the Nazis are a terrific example of it. And they'll brainwash people to the extent that everybody thinks the Nazis are right wing. They're national socialists. They've just been reinvented as these right wing skinheads funded by these groups to make people think differently, because they're going to implement the same system. If you want to know what the end time is going to look like, look at what Hitler did.
Yeah.
It's going to be an exact sort of carbon copy of that, and probably including burning people.
Yeah, I agree. We're definitely headed for dark times. But before we sum up the show, I want to give you the chance. If people want to know more about you or order your book, where can they go?
Well, first of all, you can go to my website, www.genesis6conspiracy.com. On there, I've got a blurb on the 98 chapters. I left out the preface and the epilogue, so I guess technically I got 100 chapters in my book. There's on each chapter, there's a little bit of write-up on there to give you a flavor of what that chapter is all about. I'm also on Facebook, and I'm also on Twitter. And if you're looking for me, just to Google Genesis 6 Conspiracy, you're going to find me. It's available. The book is available in hard copy and Kindle format. It's available on my website for a personalized copy if you want it personalized or autographed. There's also links to get the Kindle version there. There's also links to barnesandnoble.com and to amazon.com. My book is available on pretty much all the online distributors of books around the world, including Fishbond, including Amazon around the world, and many other ones. It's also available through Christian bookstores. STL Distribution, it distributes my book to the stores. So if you want to go into your favorite bookstore, they have it. At least they'll have it available if they don't have it on the shelf. So it's fairly widely available. All depends on how much you want to pay and where you want to buy it from.
Fantastic, and everybody should check it out. It's an excellent book. So to sum up the whole show, what would be the one main thing that you would want the audience to take away from this episode?
Well, I would say two things. One is learn about history and prehistory so you can understand what's going to happen. And the second thing is pay very close attention to the imagery and the allegories and the types of beings and things that we're talking about in this book, because if you want to understand the times we're in, this imagery is everywhere. And it's also part of history, and it's there for a reason. You want to learn about why what Cinderella is all about, you're going to get it in this book. You're going to understand why fairies are so popular, why trolls are in so much literature. It's going to tell you what to look for to decode the times that we're in.
Fantastic. All right. Well, it looks like we're about all the time, but I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and telling us about your research. It's been an absolute blast. It's a great book, and I really can't thank you enough for coming on the show.
Oh, appreciate it. Enjoyed our conversation. Invite me back anytime. This is a passion of mine. I just love to talk about it.
Absolutely. We'll definitely have to have you back on. That would be great. That, again, was Gary Wayne, author of this excellent book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind. I obviously highly recommend it. Gary's one of those authors, again, like I said before, that proves there is still more to learn on the Nephilim, and at least 800 pages. And again, don't let the large size of the book be daunting, or it's an easy to understand read. It's not complicated, and it's broken up into like Gary said, about 100 chapters. So each chapter is kind of like its own mini book, and it's just packed with information. You can't go wrong. I also want to state for the show, make sure to stay tuned to future episodes. We are doing some exciting things. We're going to be adding some new elements to the show to help it grow. We'll be trying out a few new things and getting some more people involved, in fact. If all goes to plan, we're going to be implementing some of these things, some of these new additions as early as the the episode after the next episode. So, so not the next one, but the one after that. So make sure to stay tuned. It's going to be exciting. Now, if you would like to find more episodes of The Sharpening, you can do so at ministudyministry.com and my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Josh Peck Disclosure. Also, if you care to help support Mini Study Ministry, you can do so at ministudyministry.com. Your donations help go to the everyday running of the ministry and help bring more episodes of The Sharpening, as well as more books and other materials. And as I do in every episode, I'll say it again, please only donate if you feel God leading you to do so. If you're not sure, or if you don't feel led, you can always pray for us. We can always use more prayer. We're not 501c3, so your donations aren't tax deductible. And also, I'm never going to be the kind of person that's going to promise extra blessings or a miraculous tenfold return on your money or anything like that if you choose to donate financially. We're not in the business of making promises for God. But what I can promise is that your help, whether it's prayer or financial, it's greatly appreciated. It keeps us going, and it's the only reason we're able to continue doing what we do. So all of that being said, I want to thank you so much for joining us. This has been The Sharpening, and I am your host, Josh Peck. As always, take care, and God bless.